You're watching LiveONE.TV from New York with a special report on a new bill proposal by New York's Mayor Eric Adams and the Department of City Planning called City of Yes. City Council is set to vote on the bill May 1st, and if it's passed, it will radically and profoundly affect the quality of life for residents and homeowners in New York's 5 boroughs. LiveONE.TV got to talk with Paul Graziano, a planning, zoning, preservation expert who explained the bill and how people can get involved. Hi, and welcome to LiveONE.TV. I'm Ian Carpenter. I'm here today with our guest, Paul Graziano. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Paul is from North Flushing, Queens, New York. He's very familiar with the planning and zoning and preservation projects that are going on in the city. And he's here today to talk about something called the City of Yes. Yeah. Tell us about that.
Sure. So just to give everybody a little bit of a background, starting a few years ago, there was a real push, not just in New York City, but across the country to come up with new push for increased density everywhere. Okay, it really started in the city around 2020. It started with the former Speaker of the City Council, Corey Johnson. He came up with a plan called Planning Together, and he said he was going to change land use across the city permanently with this new plan. And I took a look at the plan, and the first thing he wanted to do was get rid of single-family zoning across the city of New York. And then he wanted every community board to increase density every decade.
What does single, I don't want to stop you at every point, but for people who aren't familiar with it, what is single-family dwelling?
Well, a unit, let's call it a unit of housing, can be an apartment, it could be a house, it could be a condo, a co-op, however you define it. But generally speaking, a single-family home is a home that has one family in it, right? So it could be a row house, it could be a detached home on a big piece of property, it could be a small semi-attached house with driveways. It's just based on the occupancy, right? But in New York City, a single-family home there is only zoning in the city of New York for detached single-family homes, and it only makes up a very small percentage of the city of New York. So when folks go out to the suburbs, they go to places in Nassau or Westchester or New Jersey, and they go and drive through these places that are all single-family homes on an acre or a half acre or a quarter acre. That's the norm. Okay, that's normal. New York City it's the exception. There are only a few areas that have single-family zoning, and we'll get a little more into that. Yeah. But the problem here is that the proposals that are coming forward, and again, the first was with Corey Johnson 3+ years ago in the end of 2020, he came up with this plan to get rid of single-family zoning in the city, to make every community board upzone, increase density every decade. And if those community boards didn't do it in agreement with the council members, then a new city planning commission over the current city planning commission with a Wizard of Oz-like character would designate areas and say, okay, that area is going to be upzoned to allow new dense development. So myself and a friend of mine, Renee Hill, who's the former chair of Community Board 12 in Jamaica's St. Albans Hollis area, we created a coalition, and ultimately, without getting into the details, we ended up stopping this after a few months, and it was dropped. Mm-hmm. Okay. Then in 2021, Andrew Cuomo resigned, new governor named Kathy Hochul. Kathy Hochul came in early 2022 with a single sentence. The sentence was, we need to get rid of outdated zoning laws that are holding back housing supply. This was in her State of the State address. So I looked at what was in the State of the State address. She wanted to eliminate single-family zoning across the entire state of New York. She wanted to force every municipality to allow what are called accessory dwelling units. These could be in a cellar, a basement, an attic, a room in a house, a converted garage, or a new house behind your house in your backyard. Okay? She was going to force every town, village, city across the state to allow these while eliminating one-family zoning. She wanted to increase density around every train station, first in 2022 just outside of the city, and then in 2023 inside the city, by very, very high exponential density. And she wanted to grant blanket amnesty for all illegal conversions within New York City. An illegal conversion is when you have a 1 or 2 family home and all of a sudden someone decides to put an illegal apartment in the basement or in the cellar. We know people have died in these places. They are not, unlike what the advocates for these particular types of housing are, they are not affordable units. These are market rate, substandard units. People are charging $3,000 a month for people to live in a very dangerous basement or cellar situation or an attic. They burn. They get flooded, as we saw in Ida, where 20-something people died, across Queens mostly. So these are not good things to be giving blanket amnesty for the landlords, the greedy, illegal landlords who are putting people through misery, not paying property taxes, not changing their C of Os, not claiming this on their income taxes as capital gains. It's all under the table. And no changing of these rules to legalize them will, quote unquote, bring them into the sunlight, which is what the governor and the mayor have said. Well, if we regulate them, then they're going to do the right thing. These folks don't want to be regulated because if they're regulated, then they have to pay income tax. Then they have to change their C of Os. They have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to modernize, if they can even do it with these units. So these blanket amnesties for these kinds of things were being done to essentially stop all regulation of these very dangerous and illegal situations, and certainly not always dangerous, but often dangerous situations. Okay, so we created a coalition called Save One Family New York, SaveOneFamilyNY.org. And we created that in 2022 to fight this statewide. So I started getting groups in Queens and Staten Island and Brooklyn and the Bronx, and then in Westchester, Nassau, Suffolk, and across the state, Ithaca. I started cold calling people, civic groups. I'd never done that before. Rochester, Buffalo, whatever. And speaking to elected officials and associations of towns and villages and cities who were all horrified by these proposals. She put them into the budget. So what she did was she dumped this legislation into the budget bill. And the idea was if she dumps it in the budget, it's harder for the state legislature to stop it because they have to vote the budget up or down. It's not like a regular thing where a state senator or an assembly person or a council person, for example, introduces a bill and then it can be considered on its merits and whether it's going to move forward. Instead, if you dump it in the budget, it's the 3 men in the room, the assembly leader, the Senate leader, and the governor, negotiating on what passes in that huge budget bill that has to pass every year. So we got her in 2022 to remove almost all of this legislation through tremendous pressure from those elected officials, Democrats and Republicans. However, she did leave the legalization of basement and cellar, the blanket amnesty for illegal conversions. We had to have that taken out later. I warned everybody in 2022, if this goes forward, if she gets reelected, this will come back. And sure enough, she was reelected. And in 2023, she came out with something called the Housing Compact. The Housing Compact was the same as what she was doing in 2022, except even more. And what she was doing was saying, not only will there be accessory dwelling units, transit-oriented development, high density, within a half a mile diameter of all rail stations, all subway stations in the city, outside of the city, and blanket amnesty for illegal conversions, but every municipality would have to increase housing by 1% per year downstate and 1% every 3 years upstate. 1% a year doesn't sound like a lot, but New York City has 3 million units of housing. So 1% would be 30,000 units, which is a lot of units that the city would have to do. Yeah. So the fact is, if the city didn't meet that threshold, then the state would start allowing apartment buildings wherever they want. Okay, so once again, our coalition came together. You might remember in 2023, the state budget was late, just as it's late this year. It was late by 21 days. The reason it was late was two reasons: bail reform and the housing compact. The Assembly and Senate leaders told her, we will not support this. And she refused to drop it out of the budget. It took her 21 days to finally remove it from the budget, and then the budget went through. Part of the reason is everything she was doing in housing was actually violating the state constitution. And most people don't understand this, but New York is a rather unique state. We have a lot of problems in the state, but one of the things that's very unusual about our state is we have something called home rule. Home rule is when the local governments, whether it's New York City or the city of Yonkers or the town of Hempstead or whatever it is, has power equal to the state. In most states, local governments are subservient to the state government, but not in New York. It's very unusual, and people don't understand this. They think the state is trying to push us down. What she was trying to do was violate Section 9 of the state constitution, which allows for local governments to control their own land use, their own taxation, their own infrastructure, their own schools, not mandates from the state. So oftentimes when there is a bill in the legislature, it says, this shall affect all cities 1 million people and more. There's only one city that's 1 million people and more. That's New York City. But it says 1 million people or more within 30 days of receiving a home rule message from those cities. So they would need that message from the city council and the mayor saying, okay, you can move forward with this bill. They need permission from the city to do this. Most other places in the country, the state government makes a law and it affects all of the towns and they have no say over it. So she was literally, we would have gone to court. If it had passed, we would have gone to court, and the court in the state of New York would have said, you're violating the state constitution, and thrown the whole thing out. But in the meantime, the damage that would have been caused would have been tremendous. Okay, fast forward to our current situation, City of Yes. And I'm sorry I went on about this, but this is important to give the arc of the narrative here. So Mayor Adams was elected in 2021. He came into office at the beginning of 2022. He immediately charged his supporters, who are mostly big developers, and his donor contributions were primarily from big real estate, big developers, big construction companies, big business, etc. And he created something called the Blast Committee. The Blast Committee was his hand-picked group of donors. And he said to them, I want you to come up with a list of all the things you think we need to do to make development happen in New York City. Literally. I'm being polite by saying it this way, but he essentially created this group to come up with a wish list. Most of that wish list is now the City of Yes. So the City of Yes is a 3-part package of proposals. The first part was called City of Yes for Carbon Neutrality. Much of this had to do with energy efficiencies, new technology. Some of it was okay, in my opinion. Some of it was terrible, but it was the least offensive of the 3 sections. That passed in December. Okay, it was the least controversial of the 3 sections. The section that we're dealing with right now, with the sole city council hearing on Monday, April 8th, beginning at 10:30 in the morning, is City of Yes for Economic Opportunity. This is 18 separate proposals focusing on commercial zoning, but it actually intersects with residential neighborhoods tremendously. And the third piece, which has not been certified yet, but is the biggest part of this, is called City of Yes for Housing Opportunity. And there are something like over 40 proposals in that particular portion. The commercial piece of this is extremely dangerous. understand, back to what I said with the Blast Committee and with the list that they came up with, which was called Get Stuff Built, which of course the mayor, when he was the Brooklyn Borough president, his tagline was build, baby, build. And now we're hearing about all of the, the FBI raids and everything that had to do with Turkish developers and other developers, many of which are in this circle. That's why we think that something is going to happen to him at some point. But when it happens, who knows? And even if he's indicted, and even if he resigned as mayor, that's not going to stop this train from moving forward. And that's why it's really important that everybody understands what it is. So the 18 commercial proposals are proposals like, for example, proposal number 16, which would allow every corner on every residential block in New York City to potentially have commercial in it. So think about this. Now, here we are sitting in Astoria, Queens. Astoria has some very well designated commercial strips, whether it's Broadway or 31st Avenue or 21st Street or Steinway Street. These are, shopping districts or strips, neighborhood strips. You also have occasional isolated buildings in areas that have commercial use. This would allow anybody who's within 100 feet of a corner to have up to 2,500 square feet of commercial office, retail, or storefronts. Maybe in a place like Astoria, it would have less of an effect because there is a lot of commercial activity. But imagine in a place like Whitestone, or in Laurelton in Southeast Queens, or in Canarsie in Brooklyn, or in other primarily residential communities around the city who don't want that to happen, right? They don't want commercial on every corner. Particularly as we see how the city isn't regulating commercial use as it is today. We have a buildings department that every 5 to 10 years, half the department either resigns, retires, gets indicted, or goes to jail. So, and there's a reason for that, because they're either taking payoffs or they're incompetent or both, right? So we don't have the enforcement mechanisms. Communities that are residential in nature don't want commercial in the middle of their residential communities. They have designated areas where that commercial makes sense, particularly in the lower density parts of the city. Okay, so, the mayor's tagline for the housing piece is just a little more housing in every neighborhood. For the commercial piece, which by the way is totally false, for the commercial piece, it's we're doing this because we need to modernize. Anytime you hear the words streamline, modernize, fast track, all of these taglines are just code, as we call it, for deregulation, right? Deregulation. This is long. It's interesting. This has long been tend to have been tied with the Republican Party, right? We remember in the 90s and even in the 2000s when Republicans ran the government in the federal government. It was, we need to cut red tape. We need to get rid of these environmental regulations because they're stopping us from having economic prosperity and all of these things. Well, the interesting shift is in the last 10 years, it's flipped. And now Democrats are the ones, many of them, are the ones who are promoting essentially stuff that was being fought against 10, 15, 20 years ago by the other party, right? So to me, that's an interesting side note to all of this. But when you start hearing groups saying, we need this, we need to have more commercial development in the city of New York, and we need to make it easier. Okay. I started questioning the Department of City Planning. I actually went to multiple community boards while they were considering this back in December and January. I was actually going head to head with the Department of City Planning, who I've dealt with for decades. And the stories that would come out when I would ask questions about these various proposals, the 18 proposals, the responses were every single planner said something different, right? they were reading off of a script. Most of them didn't even know what the proposal was. The way all of this works, just for the audience to understand, is whatever someone says to you verbally means nothing. The only thing that matters is the text that's written. So zoning text is legalese. It's very dense. Most people don't understand it. That text is the law. So when city planning would put up a slide for proposal number 16, for example, that said, create a process that would allow for corner stores and bodegas in residential neighborhoods. Then you look at the text, and the text says, allow commercial, office, storefront, retail up to 2,500 square feet within 100 feet of every corner on every residential block in New York City. Okay, those are two very different things. So they would say one thing, and then I would get up and say, well, actually, this is what the text says. And the community boards, by the way, who overwhelmingly voted against all of this, I want to make that very clear. And for those folks who are watching, community boards are the lowest level of government in New York City. They're sort of your neighborhood councils. They are advisory only. A lot of people don't understand that. They are advisory only, but they carry weight in public opinion. They can be influential in situations. However, the mayor can ignore them. The Department of City Planning can ignore them. The council members can ignore them. So the community boards would say, well, we don't want this. Well, you're telling us, city planning, that Community Board 14, for example, which is the Rockaways, we have 12% vacancy rate on our retail strips. We have all these empty storefronts, and we're trying to fill up these storefronts. Why would we want to create a new process that would allow for, corner stores in residential areas when we're trying to get them back onto the retail strip? And as I said, varied responses. Oh, it's never going to happen. Well, if it's never going to happen, why are you proposing it, right? Oh, well, over the years, we've had a few requests from owners, property owners, that if this had been in place, well, then maybe we would have supported doing this. Oh, well, it's not going to happen because they're going to have to go through an environmental review and traffic study and CPC, City Planning Commission. We're still going to have to support and do this. We're going to have to approve it. We're the gatekeepers. It'll never happen. So after it passed the City Planning Commission 11-1 4 weeks ago, the mayor put out a press release. And on the bullet point of the press release, the new propaganda for this particular proposal is, we want to have the 265,000 people who are not living within a quarter of a mile of a retail store have access to one. And it sounds like a lot of people, 265,000 people, but it's 3% of the population of the city of New York. And most of those people live in suburban parts of the city like Staten Island or Southern Brooklyn or the North Bronx or Eastern Queens, who don't want a corner store within a quarter of a mile of their home or down the block or wherever. So something isn't right about all of this, and that's been the process the entire time. That's just one of the 18 proposals. Many of these proposals are, in my opinion, poison. They will destroy communities. There are a few proposals that have less of an effect. They're not as harmful, but the vast majority of the proposals, of these 18 proposals, are bad. A few of the other proposals. Proposal number 15. Again, the way it was stated was, allow NYCHA, that's Housing Authority, public housing, allow NYCHA housing to be able to have commercial on the ground floor, NYCHA housing and other residential campuses. The text says, any property 1.5 acres or more, doesn't have to be NYCHA, doesn't have to be any other residential community, can just be empty land. 1.5 acres or more. It can be divided by a street. It can be divided into multiple parcels, as long as it's one owner. Can build up to 15,000 square feet of commercial, either in a new building or in an existing building. Okay. that's what the actual text says versus what city planning was telling the community boards and the public. Another one, number 11, allow people to have broader home businesses than are allowed today. Today, if you've got a home business, you're allowed to use your home as a home business, but it's very restricted what you can do. It's usually a professional. It's a lawyer, an accountant. I'm an urban planner. I have a home office, right? So you're allowed to do that up to 500 square feet or 25%. So if you're in a 1,000 square foot apartment, you can use 250 square feet. If you're in a house or something bigger, up to 500 square feet maximum. Okay. So again, this is mostly for professionals or small businesses that are sole proprietors, owners who are just running everything themselves. They want to change that. Instead of 25% of your home, 49% of your home, 1,000 square feet, and up to 3 employees in your home. And not just professionals or sole businesses, but barbershops, nail salons, retail, all kinds of other things that don't belong in people's homes. Okay? Again, community boards ask questions. Why would we want to encourage people to open up retail or other businesses in their homes when, again, we've got a 12% vacancy rate in our retail areas and we want to revitalize those commercial areas? The response from city planning was incredible. Well, we believe that if people are entrepreneurial and start a business in their home, they're going to outgrow that space. And at that point, they will move that business to a retail strip. And I said, listen, I've had my own business for 25 years. I don't pay any rent, and I write my area that I work out of on my taxes, right? I actually get a tax write-off for that. Why would I want to spend $5,000 or $10,000 a month on a space when I can do it for free at home? So again, there is a massive disconnect between the quote-unquote reasons that city planning are promoting this and the reality. The reality is, again, this is deregulation. This is rules written for people who are speculators, not entrepreneurs, speculators. This is about real estate speculation. That's not the regular person who lives in our city. So that's the economic portion. And again, there are multiple proposals on this. I'll give this little story. I think it'll be good for the audience. When I was at Community Board 10 in the Bronx, which is Throg's Neck, City Island, that area in the Eastern Bronx, which is one of the more suburban parts of the Bronx, I was there when city planning was there the night that they were going to vote on this particular set of proposals. The person for who was representing city planning was there, as was the director of city planning for the Bronx. They spoke. They gave very short, 40-second answers. 1-sentence explanations for very complex proposals. So, if the public didn't already understand that something was wrong with this, which they did, they would just take them at their word and not question it. And I got up and I said, well, again, like I've just been explaining, this proposal, it's not what it seems. It says that on the page, but this is what it actually is, and et cetera, et cetera. And the community board members, one community board member asked the staffer for city planning, is there an ability for us to get a copy of this 1,127 pages that's going to be the zoning? This is going to be the law? And the response from city planning first was, oh, you can just go online and find that. So they didn't supply the actual zoning text to the community boards who are voting on this, okay, anywhere in the city. That's number one. Number two, the planner person, who was a young woman, I don't remember her name, she said, I don't have the 127 pages. And I was sitting next to her. I said, it's not 127 pages, it's 1,127 pages. And she said, oh, I don't have 100 copies of the 127 pages. So this is the professional staffer for the Department of City Planning not knowing the basics of this proposal. Another question was asked by someone who lived in NYCHA housing. She lives in the Throxneck houses, and she's on the community board. And she said, am I to understand that Proposal 15, which would allow 15,000 square feet of commercial, is only for NYCHA housing? Now, I had already gotten up and said, this isn't only for NYCHA housing, it's for all large properties. But I guess she didn't understand what I was saying, which, no problem with that. I get that. The director of the Bronx stood up and said, that's right, this will only affect NYCHA housing. The director of the Bronx Department of City Planning. So again, I can understand a low-level person not knowing the basics, or not knowing the details, but knowing the basics. I can't understand a top-level person not knowing the specifics. And that's a pretty big specific, right? Yeah. So I had to get back up there and say, excuse me, director, with all due respect, that's not true. And in fact, I brought this up 5 minutes ago. So as I said, there's a lot of gaslighting going on. There's a lot of, the staff don't know the details, some of them. Some of them do know the details and aren't being honest about it. And some of them are just outright lying. So this is not a good process to be going down this road, right? 2/3 of the community boards voted this down. The Department of City Planning and the City Planning Commission chair ignored those 2/3 and only focused on the 1/3 of community boards, mostly Manhattan boards, who voted in favor with conditions, right? So they didn't just give them a blanket approval. They said, we want changes here, 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 and here. They only looked at a few of those changes and then incorporated them into the modified version, which is going in front of the City Council on Monday. But put out a great trumpeted press release saying, we listened to the community, and the community told us that they wanted this. And they literally took, 4 recommendations from 4 community boards out of 59 and, didn't do much. I mean, the changes are extremely modest. So that's the commercial piece of this. Any questions?
No, I'm enjoying all of this. This is amazing to hear.
All right. Just want to make sure if there's anything, because I know I'm going on a bit of a monologue here, so I want to.
59 city community boards,
Correct.
but 51 city council members?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. So you always have council members who represent more than one community board because there are 59 community boards. So, for example, where I live in Northeast Queens, my council person represents parts of boards 7 and 11. Okay. Another council person has parts of boards 7, 11. No, I'm sorry. Has parts of boards 11, 8, and 13. Right. So typically, council members control, or not control, but represent areas that are at least 2, sometimes 3 community boards that they, and sometimes even 4, depending on how the district is drawn. So yes. So the one thing about community boards that I've known for 30 years is whether you like them or not, and whether you consider them to be, important or not, the one thing they don't like is to not be taken seriously. And whether it's because they're upset about some property that's got garbage on it or whatever, to be kind of, shoved to the side in the process and by the people who are in power making decisions. Because at the end of the day, with all of this, the only thing that matters is the City Planning Commission and the City Council. They are the executive and the legislature that makes the decision. But if they're smart, they're going to listen to the community boards, at least to an extent, right? Even though they're only advisories. By the way, the borough presidents are also advisory. The borough presidents, however, are not only, except for Staten Island, they are rah about all of this. They're just in league with the mayor on this and making all kinds of ridiculous statements and claims. I just will say. I don't want to get too far into that because to me, that's more propaganda and rhetoric, and they're also advisory, so they don't have much of a say. But it's only one person versus a community board, which is really the closest thing we have to local town government in the city.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about the housing part. Okay, so I kind of mentioned some of the previous housing proposals under the governor and under the speaker, the former speaker of the council. This set of proposals, there's about 40 proposals. So if you thought that 18 proposals mixed in with, 1,127 pages was a lot, now you're talking about something like 40 proposals, and it's going to be thousands and thousands of pages. It hasn't even been released yet. We don't know what the text is yet. But based on the scope of work that was produced about 6 months ago, which they're moving forward with, that was their draft scope of work, the 40 proposals are moving forward. So let's talk about the most egregious 5 that, if any one of these is put forth, will be a nuclear bomb. Okay, and then we'll talk about some of the other pieces, and very, very briefly. But let's start with, again, the theory behind this. The theory is the mayor, and again the rhetoric and the propaganda is, we need more housing in the city of New York. We are desperate for housing. So the first thing I'm going to say is, none of these plans, this plan, this proposal, the governor's proposals, and Corey Johnson's proposal, none of them included affordable housing. The affordable housing portion of this plan is laughable. All it will do is give additional density to developers who already have to build affordable housing. They'll just get more density, 20% more. That's it. That is the entire thing about affordable housing. This is about destroying owner-occupied neighborhoods, areas with high percentages of owner-occupied homes, which, by the way, across the city of New York is about 1/3 of all units are owner-occupied. So if we have 3 million units in the city of New York, 1 million of them are owner-occupied. But they are primarily in the lower density areas of the city. They are in much of Queens, all of Staten Island, the southern and central parts of Brooklyn, and the north and east parts of the Bronx. These are the areas with the highest percentages of owner-occupied housing. There are some other areas that have some too, Upper West Side, Upper East Side, etc. But for the most part, owner-occupied housing is what's left of the working and middle class in the city of New York, right? Is essentially this arc on the outer rim of the city. Staten Island, southern Brooklyn, a good chunk of Queens, and the north and east of the Bronx in this semicircle. The goal, the statement is, we need more housing. Why do we need more housing? We have lost over 1 million rent-stabilized apartments in the city of New York in the last 25 years. Now, if that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not claiming that. That had to do with landlords saying, we aren't getting enough money to maintain these places, and it took them a long time, but they got the governor at the time and the state and the legislature and the city council all on board, and the mayor at the time. I think this was under Giuliani this all started, and Pataki, if I remember. But they agreed to create a decontrol limit. So if once that unit hit a certain amount of money, all of a sudden it's on the open market. And we've lost over 1 million units that were affordable and have been replaced by market rents. Okay, we have tens of thousands of units of rent-stabilized units that are being left vacant on purpose. Okay, we have tens of thousands of units of public housing that are vacant. Many of them because they are in such poor repair, nobody can live in them, but they need to be repaired. And we have, by the way, tens of thousands of units that are brownstones and townhouses in Manhattan and Brooklyn that uber rich people have bought in the last 50 years and converted back to single family homes. So these are units where, if you remember, you grew up in the 60s and 70s, and I grew up in the 70s and 80s. There were lots of places where you had a brownstone that had 16 units in it. And many of those places particularly in Manhattan and in Brooklyn, there is one way to get rid of those units, and that is to convert it back to a single family home. So there are literally tens of thousands of units where, again, uber rich people have bought these buildings, tossed out affordable units, and converted them back to single family homes. Okay, again, I don't hold any grudge against anybody doing anything, but I'm just giving the actual facts as to why we have an affordability issue in New York versus a housing crisis. We have been, by the way, in a continuous housing crisis in New York City since 1948. Every single year, we have been in a housing crisis. A housing crisis is defined by 5% vacancy rate or less. Okay, so we have never had, in our lifetimes, had a situation where New York City did not have a emergency housing crisis based on that vacancy rate. And again, the population in the city went down over 1 million people between 1960 and 1970. And it took 3 decades to get back to where it was in 1960. Around 2000, we had about 8.2 million people. In 2000, we had about 8.1 million people in 1960. We went up to about 8.8 million people in 2010. We have lost 600,000 people in the last 5 years in the city of New York. 600,000 people. And we're continuing to lose people. So again, I ask, what really is the housing crisis here? And what is the solution that is being proposed? And that is the Housing Opportunity City of Yes. So let's talk about, sorry to go on that kind of tangent, but I think it's important for people to get basic statistics. So there are 5 major parts to the City of Yes housing opportunity. The first part is accessory dwelling units. So the City of New York wants to allow all 1 and 2 family properties to have an accessory dwelling unit. Again, a cellar or a basement, an attic, a room in a house, a converted garage, or a house behind your house.
Yeah, that's the one I like, the house behind the house. I think it's starting at 800 square feet or something.
No, that maximum 800 square feet. Maximum 800 square feet, yes. And again, we're back, we're all of these proposals are going straight back to the 19th century. Part of what they want the state to do is get rid of the multiple dwelling law. The multiple dwelling law is what makes us safe. The multiple dwelling law was passed to stop developers in the early 1900s from building buildings that people were going to die in. That's what the multiple dwelling law is. So the goal for the city is to get rid of big parts of that to allow for accessory dwelling units. For example, you need 8-foot heights in ceilings. That's for safety. They want to bring that down to 7 feet, or in some cases get rid of it altogether. Okay? There has to do with stuff having to do with piping and heating and all of this other stuff. Obviously, basements and cellars tend to have those heating. That's where your boiler is. That's where your whatever, your heating and
your
cooling
gas lines.
unit, your gas lines, everything. This, as I said, straight back to the 19th century. The goal here is to lower the standards that we have that keep us safe. Okay, so accessory dwelling units defined by the Department of City Planning is gentle density. That's what they call it. Now, let me say this. I brought it up at the beginning. Single family zoning takes up a very small portion of the city of New York. The rhetoric around this is, and again, this is all over the Department of City Planning. You can go onto their website. This is on their official Twitter/X, whatever. This is the propaganda. We need to get rid of exclusionary zoning. Okay, exclusionary zoning is essentially something that doesn't let you build anything you want, right? So the suburbs have exclusionary zoning because they say you can only build a single family home on a half acre or an acre, right? In New York City, we have exclusionary zoning. Some of it's exclusionary multifamily zoning, which doesn't really make sense. Some of it is 1 and 2 family homes. Most cities in the United States, major cities, have 65 to 85% single family zoning. Seattle, 81% single family. Hold on. Seattle, we have 79% single family, I believe, is Chicago. 77% single family, Portland, Oregon. 75% Los Angeles. 70% Minneapolis. Even Washington, D.C., which, if anybody's ever been there, looks like a pretty dense place. There's a lot of row houses everywhere. It's a 36% single family. New York City, 15%. 15% single family, 2/3 of which is east of the Van Wyck Expressway in Queens. 2/3 of the single family zoning is eastern Queens. Most of the rest of it is on Staten Island. Of course, these are the areas that are farthest from transit, farthest from infrastructure, farthest from, anything. They are the suburban areas of the city, right? Two-family zoning makes up about another 9% of the city. So less than 25% of the city is zoned 1 and 2 family, as opposed to most other cities in the United States where they are combined 80, 90% or more. You cannot make a case that New York City has exclusionary zoning, because if it did, it would be 60, 70, 80%. That's majority exclusionary zoning. Most of these communities that are single family zoning, perhaps 70 years ago, they were exclusionary. They had things saying no African Americans, no Irish, no Italians, no Jews, whatever. But today, the largest area of single family zoning is Southeast Queens, which is the largest middle class Black community in the United States, who treasure and defend their single family zoning. And in some cases, their 2-family zoning. These are homeowners who had to fight 5 times as hard to get what they wanted. And now the city is saying, we want to get rid of your neighborhoods. Your neighborhoods don't deserve to exist. And we're doing this for racial justice. Obviously, rhetoric, propaganda. And believe me, I work with these folks on a daily basis, and they're not having any of it. Okay, so that's why folks are very opposed to ADUs, because it's immediately going to eliminate home ownership, 1 and 2 family homes. And what's happened around the country is that anywhere ADUs have been proposed, they have created a new speculative class where speculators are coming in, buying a single family home, and then all of a sudden they're converting that into a 2 or a 3 or a 4 family because the new laws let them do this, right? We have a very small percentage of the city of New York that has 1 and 2 family zoning. There is no reason to change this. The city has said the low density neighborhoods in the city, and that includes, by the way, Astoria and other parts of Queens that you would think are kind of high density, like here. These are low density according to the city. We are the cause of the housing crisis. They have stated this publicly. We are the cause of the housing crisis, which makes no sense. Okay. The second piece, so ADUs was the first piece. The second piece is transit-oriented development. Transit-oriented development is, again, what Kathy Hochul's proposal was to create a radius around train stations or subway stations where they would have to have a minimum, the zoning would have to change to allow for a minimum number of units. So 50 units per acre or whatever it was, depending on where it was. Again, in theory, like ADUs, these are planning tools. These are tools, right? But they should be done on a case-by-case basis. They should be done in a situation where, it makes sense here. It doesn't make sense here. All of what they're proposing would just be across the board everywhere, right? So the new map that the city is proposing for transit-oriented development covers about 1/3 of Queens, 1/3 of Brooklyn. Parts of it are nowhere near any subways or Long Island Railroad stations anywhere. About 20% of the Bronx and a smaller area of Staten Island. In these transit zones, they would allow on a wide street that's 75 feet wide or wider, any property on that wide street would be allowed to have an apartment building. On a narrow street, the corner properties would be allowed to have apartment buildings. Now, that's on large lots. The definition of a large lot, 5,000 square feet. This is not a large lot. A typical lot in a single family zone is 40 by 100. It's 4,000 square feet, or 60 by 100, 6,000 square feet. So a 5,000 square foot lot is typical property, right? Now, all of a sudden, a single family or a two family area is now going to be allowed to have apartment buildings. And all a developer needs to do is buy one property, or maybe two properties next to each other, and they'll be able to build an apartment building. And in the lower density areas like Astoria or Ridgewood or other areas in Queens that you can think of, now instead of being able to build small apartment buildings, they'll be able to build much bigger apartment buildings. Okay, so that's the transit-oriented development zone. The third piece is town center zoning. Town center zoning will be for all commercial overlays. A commercial overlay is a zone on top of a residential zone. So let's say you have a residential area, it's zoned R5, which is what this area is, R5B. And then you have a commercial overlay on 31st Avenue or on Broadway. That's where commercial is allowed, right? In the lower density areas that have commercial overlays, they will allow up to 4 stories of residential above commercial. Now, in Astoria, that may not be too dramatic, but in places like Francis Lewis Boulevard in Flushing or in Bayside or Union Turnpike in Jamaica Estates or places like that, or Merrick Boulevard down in St. Albans, this is going to be cataclysmic because these are areas that have 1-story retail stores, maybe with 1 floor above it, with studio apartments that tend to be, by the way, the most affordable units in the area. And they're going to now be able to build 4 stories of residential on top of that 1 story of commercial. Okay. The fourth piece is to basically savage the basic regulations of the zoning resolution. We live under something called the zoning resolution that was adopted in 1961. So that's the thing that says if you live in an R2 zone, you can only build single family homes. The property has to be at least 40 feet wide. The lot has to be at least 3,800 square feet. You need a 5-foot side yard, 8-foot side yard, 30-foot rear yard, 15-foot front yard. Well, they want to get rid of the side yards. They want to get rid of the backyards. They want to narrow the size of the property. They want to get rid of the lot size. They want to increase the size of the building to the size of the property. That's called the floor area ratio, the FAR. So currently, for example, in a R2 zone, you have a 5,000 square foot lot. You can build a 0.5. So you can build a 2,500 square foot building, single family home on that 5,000 square foot lot. Now, if you're in the transit zone, they want to raise that to a 1.0. So now instead of 5,000 square feet with a 2,500 square foot single family home, now you can have a 5,000 square foot lot with a 5,000 square foot building. And they want to then divide that by this other number that's called the DUF, the dwelling unit factor. Okay, so that's a number. It's a number they've created out of thin air, and that number will be 500. So 5,000 divided by 500 means that building, which used to only be a 1-family home, can now have 10 units. Okay, that would be in every zone that they're changing this to. R1 through R5 zones, the lower density zones, again, including Astoria, including Ridgewood, including Elmhurst, including all these areas that we in Queens think of as relatively dense neighborhoods, but they will be even more dense. And then the lower dense, the stuff we think of as low density, the more suburban parts, will become very urban. Okay. And the fifth one is to eliminate all parking requirements for all new residential development in the city of New York, whether it's a 1-family home or a 300-unit apartment building. And the rhetoric is, cars are evil, and people who drive cars are very evil. And we need to get rid of cars. Cars are destroying us. And the real reason is that every one of those parking spaces that developers have to build costs them money. And if they have to build, for example, let's say, I see all this new construction in Astoria. Let's say someone's building a 40-unit building down the street here. They need by law, in an R6 zone, let's say, they need by law to build 50% parking on site, in a garage, right? So now you have a 40-unit building with 20 parking spaces in that garage. Well, now they won't have to have any parking spaces. And those 20 parking spaces cost a developer $50,000 per space. So now they've pocketed another $1 million. They've made another $1 million in profit on top of whatever they're either renting or they've sold. It has nothing to do with cars. And I can tell you from experience, and I'm sure you've had this experience in Astoria, that lots of people who are buying or renting here, even if they don't have a garage, are bringing their cars here, regardless, from wherever they're from, whether they're from Long Island or Westchester or other parts of the country, they are bringing their car here. They are not getting rid of their car. In Flushing, where I live, downtown Flushing has exploded in the last 25 years. It's got at least 3 times the population it had 25 years ago. I live very close to downtown Flushing, and a lot of big buildings have been built in the last 5 years. I have a 19-story building that got built, a 12-story building. Every one of those buildings is being built with parking garages. And every one of those buildings doesn't have enough parking for all the people who are coming. And every one of those people, I think it's 86% of the population who are buying or renting these units, bring their cars. So the car situation is not going to change, okay? Not at all. Same thing with this whole thing with congestion pricing. It's sort of the same mentality, which is, well, if we're going to charge them, then they're not going to bring their cars. And I can tell you that the people who are driving into Manhattan have to drive into Manhattan. They're not driving in because they want to drive in. They're doing it because they're working. It's their job. And now they're going to be charged $15 a day on top of their bridge tolls and whatever else that they have to do, and parking and everything else. So again, it's a mindset that's not based in reality for the working and middle classes that live in Queens and work in Manhattan or don't work in Manhattan. So all of these things, those are the 5 main pieces to this. As I said, there's another 36 other pieces to this, all of which are extremely dangerous. But obviously, if these main pieces go through, it's the end of our city. It's over. And I've said this to many, many people, that our communities cannot sustain this kind of development anywhere. We have massive increased flooding. We have massive infrastructure issues. Like the previous proposals, none of these proposals come with any infrastructure, and they won't. They won't. There is no infrastructure money. There is no new subway lines. The MTA is cutting bus service. They're not adding bus service. They're cutting bus service in half right as we speak. Stops, which used to be 350 feet away from each other, are now 700 feet away from each other. Okay? Who uses buses? The elderly, immigrants, and kids. So they're making it harder for people to use them in places that don't have public transportation. This is the only public transportation they have. So if you don't have public transportation, how do you get around? A car. That's how you have to get around, right? So, as I said, all of these things are being done for the benefit of developers. They are not being done for the benefit of the community. We have never been able to build ourselves out of a housing crisis. It does not work. We would need to build 1 million units or more in 10 years to even make a dent in it. In the meantime, the population continues to decrease, as I said. The mayor stated, I want to build 100,000 units in 15 years. My moonshot is 500,000 units in 15 years. Let's do the math. 100,000 units divided by 59 community boards. We have 59 community boards. Is 1,700 units per community board on average. Divide that by 15 years. That's 120 units per year per community board. It's not a big deal. I guarantee Board 1, which is Community Board 1, which is what Astoria is approving way more than 120 units per year, or building more than 120 units per year. Okay, that's just an average. I'm just using it as, dividing it equally among all the community boards. Obviously, some boards build more, some boards build less, but that's the number that he's stating publicly. But this proposal will create the ability for developers to build tens of thousands of units everywhere. So you'll probably be posting this up during this discussion, but I've done studies already. The City Planning Commission and the Department of City Planning, they're refusing to do studies. They have actually stated, because we are rezoning the entire city, and it's what they call a generic action, we're not going to do any analysis. There's too much for us to do. So we're just going to create a bunch of models, and we're going to plug them in. So what I've done is, I've done 4 low-density studies in Queens: Douglaston and Little Neck, Jamaica Estates, Kew Gardens, and Laurelton. And I'm doing a 5th one right now in Ridgewood, showing what the effects of all of these major proposals will be on these areas. How many units of housing they have now, how many units they can have currently, and then what this proposal, if this all goes through and becomes law, what the actual potential for development will be. In places like Douglaston, in places like Jamaica Estates, Kew Gardens, Laurelton, it's 400 to 500% increases everywhere. In places like Ridgewood and Astoria, where I thought there would be less of an impact, it's huge. The impact is massive. So again, is the goal to build a little more housing in every neighborhood, or is the goal to deregulate land use and allow developers to pick and choose where and when they want to build at any time? Get rid of owner-occupied neighborhoods. These are the areas, as I said, the lower density neighborhoods. They are owner-occupied. They are primarily 1- and 2-family homeowners. Get rid of those areas which are holding back development, quote unquote, which is ridiculous, and replace them with apartment buildings for renters paying market rate. Again, nothing about affordable housing in any of this. And if these electeds continue to say, this is the way we're going to make things affordable, they just need to be constantly called out, because there is nothing affordable about this. Nothing. This is to give the mayor's friends and donors the ability to build apartments anywhere they like with zero regulation. And this is going to destroy our communities. It doesn't matter, by the way, if you're landmarked. This is one of the things that, for those people who don't know, landmarking is a designation that limits the ability of the builder to just build a box, right? They have to do stuff that's approved essentially by a design review commission. Okay, so we have 120 historic districts around the city. Most of them are in Manhattan and Brownstone, Brooklyn, most of them. In Queens, we have very few. And it's not because people didn't want them, it's because the politicians refused to designate them. So we have one, for example, in Douglaston. In Douglas Manor, we have 2 districts. Douglas Manor is single-family homes. It's a peninsula on the far eastern part of Queens, right near the Nassau County border. It's a beautiful, beautiful neighborhood. And it's referred to in The Great Gatsby. It's that whole thing. Okay, very nice place, planned community, 120 years old. It was landmarked in 1997, so about 25 years ago, a little more than 25 years ago. It also has private deed restrictions that are more restrictive than the zoning. So if the zoning were to go away, the deed restrictions would still be there. However, deed restrictions cost money to enforce. And if developers are coming in and saying, well, I can do this as of right because the city says I can, and you have to go to court, and you're going to court and going to court, you're going to end up running out of money. Because developers have much deeper pockets than communities do, just in general. I mean, I've been doing this for 25 years defending deed-restricted communities, and I can tell you they have limited resources. Finite, I think the term is finite resources, versus developers who tend to have much more deep pockets than they do. So, questions have come up. Well, our deed restrictions will protect us. Well, yes, as long as you can keep going to court to stop it. Yes, but that's eventually you're going to run out of money. Okay. Well, our landmarking will protect them. No, they won't. So yeah, you've got your landmarked single-family homes, but you know what else is landmarked? The Empire State Building. That's landmarked. The Chrysler Building is landmarked. The Landmarks Commission doesn't care if you have a one-family house or a 100-story commercial building. All they are is a design review board. If the city says you can now build a 4-story apartment building in Douglas Manor, all they're going to care about is what it looks like on the outside. They're not going to come in and say, you can't build that because it's a single-family house, and tear down the single-family house and build the apartment building. So, again, the idea of densifying communities that have no ability to absorb that kind of population and will never have that ability because they will never have the infrastructure or the resources to do this is insane. It's actually cannibalizing the places that are actually stabilizing the city. You'll probably remember, if you lived in the city in the 70s and into the 80s and even into the 90s, there were a lot of really big problems in the city. Huge problems. Crime-wise, arson, burned out buildings, lots of things. And then there were stable neighborhoods, mostly on the outer rim of the city, where the majority of working and middle-class people were living at the time, who held the city together. Well, now the city is wants to quote-unquote return the favor by getting rid of these neighborhoods that are, again, the bastion of the working and middle class in the city of New York. So in response to this, not only am I fighting this, obviously, and I'm encouraging civic organizations and community board members and anybody else who believes that the city should not do this. And the way you fight that is both through the political process, because elections are coming up, right? But also we have actually gotten a bill introduced in Albany. And this bill was introduced only 2 weeks ago, finally. This bill would allow communities across the state, not just in New York City, who are unhappy with being part of a city or a town, if they have 2,000 people or more, to create their own towns. Okay? So let me give you an example. Let's take Whitestone, for example. We can take any neighborhood, it doesn't matter, but Whitestone has 40,000 people. The area of Whitestone has 40,000 people. Let's say 40,000 people or so. There are 10,000 property owners. 2,000 of those property owners would have to sign a petition, create a town charter, and come up with a map. Submit that to the Board of Elections. And if everything is correct, there would be an election. There would be a vote in that November. And only the people who live within the boundaries of the proposed town can vote. So in other words, people from Astoria can't vote to see if Whitestone becomes its own town, for example. If that area were to vote in favor, they would then have a special election to vote for a mayor and a town council. And once they did that, within 30 days, they would no longer be part of New York City. They would be their own town. Then,
so town is different than village, I take it.
They are different types of government structures. Towns, so it's funny. Well, let me finish this and then I'll get to that. So once the town becomes a town, they would negotiate for shared services, such as sewer and water, and maybe police and fire, and maybe schools, whatever they want to negotiate for or not. Should the previous city or town stonewall the new town, the courts would step in and force the old town to negotiate with the new town for up to 4 years at a time. So this is serious stuff. And we are at an inflection point that essentially, if we don't stop this, this might become our only avenue to remove ourselves from this. And again, I've spoken to communities all over the city. Black neighborhoods, white neighborhoods, Asian neighborhoods, Hispanic, it doesn't matter what the ethnic background is. But the driving connection tends to be high percentages of home ownership, right? High percentages of feeling that the city is coming after them, literally, and saying, you don't deserve to exist, and we're going to densify you, and we're going to get rid of you. These neighborhoods are all on the same page. I've given over 70 presentations at this point in the last 3.5 months to civics all over the city. The Bronx, Brooklyn, Staten Island, Queens in particular, not Manhattan, but elsewhere. And the response has been almost universal, that if this were a possibility, 99% of the hands go up. Okay, so if that's the reaction I'm getting, the next question is, well, what's the tax implications? Which is a fair question. And then it turns out that our communities are being taxed, property tax-wise, 300 to 400%. What the richest parts of the city are being taxed. I didn't know any of this until a few months ago. I did my research. Brad Lander, who is the comptroller, who I'm not a particular fan of, but he came out with a very good report last year that showed that the outer rim of the city, most of Queens, the North and East Bronx, Southern and Central Brooklyn, and Staten Island are being taxed at a 300 to 400% rate than Greenpoint and Williamsburg and Brooklyn Heights and the richest parts of Manhattan. So we are actually paying the majority, the largest quotient of property taxes in the city of New York, and the city wants to get rid of us. It's crazy. I frankly, I cannot understand what the thought process is on this. You would think you would want to retain these neighborhoods because they are keeping the city afloat, and they are the places where people who grow up in poorer circumstances aspire to live in these places. You know, my mom grew up in Parkchester in the Bronx. My dad grew up in Astoria, right? They grew up under relatively humble means. They built a middle-class life, and they moved to a middle-class neighborhood in Flushing instead of moving out of the city, right? I've heard this story over and over again. This is what people do. And now you're creating a situation where people are already feeling like, well, what's the benefits of us living in the city? And now you're going to try to take us down. You're going to try to destroy our communities by doing this. Well, I'm just going to sell my home and move across the Nassau County border or the Westchester border or to New Jersey or somewhere else where, yeah, I might pay slightly more in property taxes. We actually pay more in property taxes per square foot in Eastern Queens and even Central Queens than Nassau County does. I did the numbers on this. But Nassau County pays more in taxes because they have larger pieces of property in general. Okay, so but again, if you're paying $11,000 a year for a one-family home now, and across Nassau County you're paying $14,000, you can afford the $3,000, not have the government come after and say, oh well, they're going to build an apartment building next to your home, and we're going to add in X, Y, and Z that you're not in favor of. Right. I mean, there's lots of grievances, but the land, what I say to everybody is, look, you can have issues with police, you can have issues with services, schools, and believe me, a lot of people do. But if your home is in danger, which is for most people their biggest investment, the place that they are living, this is the center of your universe. If that becomes threatened, the rest of it doesn't matter, right? The rest of it is the second tier. The main tier is where you are living, your home, period, your domicile. Everything else is built off of the domicile. People don't think that way until they think about it and they go, oh yeah, you're right. But that's really critical. That's your baseline. If your baseline is destroyed, the rest of it doesn't matter. It's that simple. So that bill is, I've said, desperate times call for desperate measures. That bill is, something that we are really going to be pushing very, very soon over the next month or so, since it's, we're waiting for the budget to be completed at the state level. So it's late again this year. So that's the long and the short of all of this. And I know I've given quite a monologue here, but it's very, very serious. This is the most serious challenge to the city of New York in my lifetime. It is something that is making people, millions of people, because that's who will be affected by this. Millions of people will be affected by this, extremely nervous, and have become increasingly united. We now have over 170 organizations citywide who are all aligned with this to try to stop this in Staten Island, Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx. So, on that note, any questions?
Well, it sounds like you've affirmed an idea that I've heard, which is that government policies affect our biology, because you just said a lot of people are getting nervous. So it sounds like policies affect our biology.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so I think that people are probably going to watch this video again, because I've never heard such a thorough explanation of some of the zoning of things that are affecting
people. Well, again, I'm trying to keep it relatively simple also. I'm not getting into people, just they start getting very overwhelmed by the details. But you will probably be showing some of the slides that I've given you to show the implications of what this will do. Mm-hmm. It's very serious. Right. Very serious. And the other piece is a lot of people don't know about it. You know, the people who know about it are the people that I've been able to reach out to or who pay attention, but this is a very small percentage of the population in the city of New York.
And so it sounds like we're trying to catch this problem at the 11th hour.
Well, I would say it's a little different. This has been a continuing situation now. We're in our fourth year, right? First it was Corey Johnson, then it was the governor for 2 years in a row. And now it's the mayor. And by the way, the governor still came out with stuff this year, which we still had to kill. Again, the blanket amnesty for illegal conversions, for example, and other things she still tried to put in the budget this year, which is still not completely negotiated. So we're still dealing with her. But this, because it's local, right? So remember I mentioned at the beginning, the reason, at the very least, if we had lost and the governor had put this stuff in, we could have gone to court and had it invalidated because it was violating the state constitution. Mm-hmm. This is local. So this is legal, what the mayor is doing. It is legal in the sense that we don't have the standing to say he's violating the city charter. He's not violating the city charter. This is exactly what the city charter allows him to do with the approval of the city council. So what I've told everybody is we have 51 council members. We need 26 council members to vote this down. 26. How do we do this? Mm-hmm. Some council members have already given full-throated support to this. They're also the ones who are not in danger of being thrown out of office. We have some council members who have stated their absolute opposition to this. We have some council members who have hemmed and hawed and gone back and forth. All of this is coming up for votes. As I said, the commercial piece, that will be voted on by the beginning of May. The housing piece will be voted on probably in October or November. They are immediately running for re-election right then. 2025 is the next council races. This year, it's the Assembly and the Senate races. That's why with the Assembly bill, the bill that would allow these new towns, we are already putting pressure on Assembly members, Democrat and Republican, to co-sponsor this bill because they're running for election right now. This is the only leverage we have politically, is to say to them, listen, you better support this or else. And if they don't, we have to find someone to take them down.
Did I miss it earlier? Have you talked about the bill that is in opposition to this City of Yes? That's what you're talking about?
Well, the bill is Assembly Bill 9417. This was introduced, it was actually finally made live 3 weeks ago. March 14th, I believe, was when it went live. So this bill would allow new towns to be created from existing towns or cities across the state. It's not just in New York City. And by the way, we have supporters of this bill in other places like Yonkers and White Plains and upstate. So it's not just in the city that this would affect. It could affect anywhere in the state. And that's the whole point, is we want broad support for this so that communities can have self-determination. That's really what it's about politically. It's about self-determination, saying, hey, this isn't working anymore. We have a city of 8 million, and there was always an understanding that we have 500 neighborhoods, and every neighborhood is different. And every neighborhood has its own things going on, positive and negative. And every neighborhood, some neighborhoods are very dense, some are very low density. Whatever it is, we can accommodate everybody. And this administration has said, one size fits all. One size fits all. We don't care about your area. We don't care about this. We don't care about that. And they're trying to impose this one size fits all on a very complicated place. So the only option, if we can't stop it, is to get this bill passed. And by the way, it's a constitutional amendment, the bill that we're trying to pass. It's not easy. It has to pass 2 sessions of the legislature and then a statewide referendum. If that happened, then places would have the ability to potentially go forward. And there are going to be places, if this becomes law, where places vote it down, or they can't get their act together. They can't get that 20% of property owners to support just even getting the process moving. So we know it's not a paradise, and we know that it's at least a mechanism that would give the ability for communities to determine their own future. Mm-hmm. Instead of being told by, a city of, we have a city of 8 million people. Do you know the average amount of people that each council member represents is 170,000 people? That's a city in itself, right? So we have 51 council members representing essentially 170,000 people per council member. It used to be 35 council members. They expanded it to 51. So the idea that these 51 council members who can only vote, I want to make that clear, the mayor controls every agency. He controls the Department of City Planning, the Department of Buildings, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Environmental Protection. Every agency you can think of is directly and solely controlled by the mayor. The council only has 3 major powers: budget, oversight, and land use, and constituent services, obviously, and introducing bills, that kind of stuff. But the 3 main powers: budget, budget, oversight, and land use, right? So the city, the mayor, through the Department of City Planning, is proposing this. It cannot go forward unless the city council votes in favor of it. That's why we need 26 votes to kill it. And it's not the 11th hour. They haven't even started this yet, but it's a continuation of, as I said, we're in year 4 of an agenda, right? The agenda is statements like single-family zoning should be eliminated. The American dream is a mistake. I've heard this from elected officials. There's one elected official in Queens, I won't mention his name, who stated, I believe, and he's a state representative, I believe that all private property should be owned by the state and people should lease the property. Now, my wife grew up in communist Poland, where they tried to collectivize the farms and they tried to take away private property. And unlike most other countries in Eastern Europe, they were only partially successful in Poland. Most other countries, they did that. They took away private property in Czechoslovakia and Hungary and all these other countries. But the idea that we have people in office right now who make statements like the American dream is a myth, where the American dream, home ownership, is the main vehicle for transferring generational wealth in the United States, and as I said before, is usually the sole asset of families. To take this away and say everybody should rent for the rest of their lives is madness. It is mad. And I say this in a nonpartisan fashion. I am not here to give credence to Democrats, Republicans, or any other party. Anybody who believes this is either has their own agenda or is misinformed or just plain crazy. This is completely backwards. We should be encouraging more home ownership. We should be encouraging more abilities for communities and people to get into that system so they can continue to prosper and bring it to the next level to their kids and their grandkids, not the other way around. Okay? So that's the problem, is we have a situation where there are elected officials who have extremely rosy notions of what socialism is and what this kind of how property operates versus, and by the way, I'm not someone who's like, capitalism is the best thing that's ever happened in the world. It's not. but the ability of people and families to pull themselves up and get into that system, which, by the way, 67% of the population in the United States are homeowners. Do you know what the homeownership rate is in the city of New York? 33%. 33%. Do you know what it is in Board 11, which is Douglaston and Basin? 71%. Board 13, which is mostly African American, 73%. Even my board, Board 7, 52%. So there are lots of areas in Queens and Staten Island, and again, smaller areas in the Bronx and Brooklyn, that have relatively high percentages of home ownership, and they want to stay that way. And they want to encourage home ownership in other parts of the city as well, not remove home ownership and get rid and destabilize these communities, which is exactly what this will do. Replacing home ownership with market rate rental units.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Paul.
My pleasure.
Yeah. And so on Monday, is that a hearing? And
It
then
is.
May 1st, there's a vote?
It'll be within a month. Okay. I mean, what they do is they'll have the hearing on Monday.
City Council.
City Council, you can go, you may not be able to sign up by tomorrow, but if you do put this out by tomorrow or Monday, it's on Monday. It's going from 10:30 in the morning until it's done. We're expecting
Down at City Hall?
down at City Hall or on Zoom, or you can call in. I'm actually doing it on Zoom because I have an 8-year-old and I have to deal with school and other things, but other people are going to be going down directly. They're expecting this to go for at least 7 to 8 hours. I would say it might even go longer than that. They have cut the amount of time that people are able to speak from 3 minutes to 2 minutes. So that's essentially 30 speakers an hour, and they're expecting hundreds upon hundreds of speakers. So my guess is this thing is going to be a very long day on Monday.
Right.
And then once they have the hearing, within the month, they will have another city council meeting, and they will have a vote. This is at the Subcommittee of Zoning and Franchises. Then it will go, once they vote on it, it will go to the Land Use Committee. They will vote on it, and then it will go to the full council, and they will vote on it. It's usually a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday that they do this. So that will happen, as I said, they cannot have that at the same day as the hearing, obviously. So that will happen within 2 to 4 weeks. They'll have another meeting that will not be open. It'll be open to the public to view, but there will be no public participation. This is your one chance for public participation, is Monday. You can send in testimony until April 11th. You can email testimony. So the only thing I'll say to the audience is that this is, the challenge of our lifetime, I would say. Again, I don't want to get involved in I'm the least political person you've ever met, meaning I don't care about parties. I don't care about what your how you perceive politics, but you have to get involved in order to have a voice. And this is what I've been doing for 30 years, and I highly recommend people do the same thing. They come in and they get involved. It's the only way that you can actually make a difference. And I've been able to make a difference for decades by doing this. It's very important. I've won many, many fights over the years because between advocating for communities or for these positions and also having the knowledge base, which is very important, and a lot of people don't have that, but I try to educate people as much as possible on these issues. You cannot be involved without being involved. You can't just sit there and go, well, how did that happen? I can't believe this happened. Well, you got those notices in the mail, you got those notices on email, and I was too busy. I cannot stress harder and more that people need to be involved. I will say this. The one thing that most elected officials are most afraid of is losing their next election. These people hold our fates in their hands. There are people who, unfortunately, term limits have created situations where there are people on the city council who are term limited out So they are not going to be up against any elected, they're not going to be up for another election. They're gone. They're looking at their next job already, right? They've already probably talked to folks saying, well, if I pass this bill for you, you're going to give me that job when I get out of office, right? And there are people who have done that. There's no question about it. So we have to make sure as residents and citizens and voters of this city that our elected officials are held accountable for their votes and their actions. The best way to do that is before, not after, right? You don't come in after the fact and say, well, how could you have done this? And the statement's going to be, well, it's already done. I can't do anything about it. So we have to be involved in this stuff, and it's the way that we can actually make the change that we want, right? That's a word I hear a statement I hear all the time. And it really is about that. It's about getting involved, making a difference, but doing it in a way that makes your elected officials work for you, not the other way around, right? That's one of the biggest things I've heard for decades is, the elected officials think of you like you need to do something for them. No, they're there to represent you. And I can tell you that a lot of people in the city of New York do not represent their constituents. Many of them do, but many of them don't. And many of them are for sale. So we have to be out there to make sure if they're representing you, great. Make sure they talk to their colleagues. Make sure they reinforce. If they're not representing you, you either have to get them to represent you or challenge them, whether it's running someone against them or making them so scared they're going to lose an election that they're going to follow what they have to do. And if they're for sale, you have to offer them a better deal than the deal that they're getting.
That's telling it like it is.
That's the way it is. I'm very pragmatic about all of this. I'm an idealist at heart, but I've been in these battles for decades, and I can tell you, the way you have to fight this is hand-to-hand combat. It's the only way to do it.
Paul Graziano, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Very much appreciate it.